This is a story that tells itself, and it is a delight to be able to share it with you, to walk through the lives of these characters who lived life in a way that was very real. The reality that we learn here is that sometimes the world gets very small. Sometimes because of sickness or threat, all we can see or hear is what's immediately around us. When someone you love is suffering, nothing else is important. The things that seemed so significant yesterday they're just set aside. When you're in danger, time stretches out into long, surreal seconds, and the rest of the world disappears. I remember loving to ride my bike when I was in college. It was a rush to go as fast as my legs would take me. I was seemingly almost flying down a hill one afternoon, and too late, I then felt the rough bump that pitched my bicycle forward. The front tire stopped. The rest, including myself, kept going. It was like an eternity in my mind as I tumbled over the handlebars, helpless to stop my fall. My body responding to fear and threat. Everything else seemed to disappear. Nothing else seemed to matter. Obviously, I lived to tell the tale and only carry a scar on one leg, but the memory is sharp. We experience danger from an accident or illness as truly visceral and vivid. The world becomes just those seconds of falling or just the anxious management of an encroaching disease. Other threats also make the world small. They are not always as obvious as a bike accident, not as easy to see or comprehend, but the world becomes small when we perceive that our dear ones or our ways of living are threatened. It can happen so gradually until all that we can manage to see, hear, or care about has small significance. And in that small space, fear becomes very large. Imagine Sarah, Abraham's wife, in this cycle of stories from Genesis. She's likely felt fairly vulnerable most of her life. Women were supposed to bear children, provide heirs. It wasn't right, but that is the way it was. Even with God's promise of an heir, Sarah had not had a child. It must have been hard to trust at that point in God's promises. To trust that God did indeed have a plan when everything she knew about what was possible seemed to point in a different direction. The world grew smaller as her fear grew. Sarah felt less than. She felt as though she was an object of pity and ridicule. What if Abraham turned her out now? So she took matters into her own hands and gave her slave girl, Hagar, to Abraham, so that Hagar's child would become Sarah's child. And when Hagar became pregnant, that really didn't make anything better. In fact, it all felt worse, and Sarah began to take it out on Hagar. Fear can make your circle of who and what matters very small. It was so bad for Hagar by this point that she had to go away. But God found her and made promises to her. And Hagar named this God who found her, God of seeing, or God who sees. Sarah's field of vision might have been very small, but God saw Hagar. God met Hagar in the wilderness, and Hagar returned to give birth to Ishmael. And then God acted beyond what Sarah had believed was possible. Sarah also gave birth to a son. At first, she just laughed out in fear. It seemed so impossible. And then she laughed with joy when Isaac was born. But then the world became threatening again for Sarah. Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Perhaps the weaning felt like a loss, the first of many steps that would take Isaac away from her, away from his mother's protection. We don't know for sure. But on the day of the feast, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son, Isaac. And suddenly, Sarah wanted them gone. Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, go away. You can almost hear the fear in her coming out as a strange anger and demand. Cast this slave woman away with her son, for the son of this slave woman will not inherit with my son Isaac. Was Ishmael too charming? Did she worry about where that charm might lead? Would Ishmael and Hagar overshadow her and her son? Had Sarah lived in vulnerability and fear for so long that she still could not perceive God's provision, even though her beautiful boy was right in front of her? When the world becomes small, fear can take up a lot of space. Abraham was distressed by Sarah's demand, but God spoke to him, and the larger plan was still in place. It's a bit of a strange statement that God makes. Standing outside of the story, we want God to stop this injustice. But God doesn't. And Abraham takes bread and a skin of water and sends Hagar and her child Ishmael, his child Ishmael, away. And they wander. They wander in the wilderness. But remember, Hagar has seen and met this God before. This is the God of seeing, the God who sees. God may have chosen Abraham and Sarah in a particular way and given them responsibility to become over a great nation, a blessing for many. But that doesn't mean that God did not care about Hagar. God's vision was greater than Abraham's or Sarah's or Hagar's. In a time when Sarah's fear made her world, her sphere of concern, smaller and smaller, God's vision was expansive. In a time when what was possible felt tightly constrained and Sarah acted to protect her own, God acted in ways that provided new possibilities. In the middle of the wilderness, Hagar put her son under the bushes and sat down to weep with an empty water skin. She'd run out of possibility. and was waiting for death. The world grew smaller and smaller by the minute as fear and despair welled up in her tears. And God saw her, and God heard her boy. Did you know that Ishmael means God will hear? The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. So come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Water, life, possibility. God saw. God heard. And the world became large again. And God was with the boy, and Ishmael grew up. I don't need to tell you that we have been living through a time of fear, or fears are about things as large and as obvious as a virus that has taken far, far too many lives. And that is only heightened by our other fears. Fears of those for whom we have great affection and love. Fears about relationships. And some of us end up living like Hagar with a fear that is born out of despair because they or their dear ones have been cast to the margins again and again and do not have access to the resources that they need for simple survival in life. Some among us live like Sarah with fear born out of vulnerability and perceived threats, and we often use our power to make ourselves feel more secure. Fear can make our worlds so very small. Our fear limits our visions, it constricts our hearts. But this story reminds us that God is present. God is in the midst of those fears. God is more powerful than any of those fears. As the writer of 1 John claims, God is love, and there is no fear in love. It's not to say that we should never feel fear. No, fear comes in life. We're vulnerable creatures, but God comes to us and speaks into those moments of fear, and God's messengers always speak from the heart of God. Be not afraid. God can give us the courage we need to lift our eyes and open our hearts to see and to hear beyond the constrictions of our fear. God's promises are true, and God's promises are expansive. And God acts in all times to make possible that which fear made us believe was impossible. And this is so important. God especially sees and hears those who are suffering. God will show up for Hagar and Ishmael. Reverend Jackie Lewis puts it this way. She says, God is a provider and a waymaker for all of those cast out and put down in our society. To the immigrant, to the incarcerated, to those injured by racism, who wonder if their lives matter. To the poor and the destitute, God will show up as creative love and power, even and especially to the least among us. That day I was riding down the hill. There was a car not far behind me, had a couple of big football players in it. And they stopped. I mean, it's like, good Lord, did he survive this? And came over to me and said, well, you obviously can't ride this bike anymore. It's pretty well wasted. But let me take you to the clinic, which he did. And as we got there, I stepped out of the car and said, I thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll be fine from here. I walked about 20 feet and collapsed. Got bandaged up and the blood stopped, and they sent me to the ER. God will show up as creative love and power in ways that we could never imagine or perceive. Because God is present with us. God is prescient to our needs. God lives every day in our lives in such a way that we too can take the next step forward. Thanks be to God.